WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Visit Bloomington. With over 350 restaurants to choose from, Bloomington, Indiana is truly a food lover's paradise. Go to visitbloomington.com to discover what suits your taste.
This is WFYI News Now. It's January 26th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, IMPD officers were involved in a shooting Thursday night that resulted in a man's death. A bill that would create a one-time training requirement for nurses in Indiana. We'll hear what the major Republican candidates for governor focused on at yesterday's forum. And 3 former administrators from virtual schools were arrested this week.
The members of the conspiracy falsely claimed thousands of students were enrolled, even though those students were not attending classes or receiving services.
Those stories coming up, but first. The Senate amended a bill yesterday prohibiting dedicated lanes for 1 year and added the creation of a task force to study the impact of those lanes. As Ben Thorpe reports, critics of the bill say it micromanages Indianapolis city government and could kill the city's proposed blue line.
In addition to studying the impact of dedicated lanes, the bill was also amended to study the impact of no turn on red signs. The city of Indianapolis passed a proposal last year banning turns at red lights, even as the state legislature blocked the move. Senator Aaron Freeman says his amendment is a compromise.
No further signs would be put up until at least July 1 of 2025 to allow a study to be done.
Senator Fadi Kadora says dedicated lanes are a local issue.
Why do we empower legislation to interfere with local government?
The bill must pass a third reading before heading to the House. I'm Ben Thorpe.
Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department officers were involved in a shooting last night that resulted in a man's death. The incident happened on the Near East Side as police attempted to stop the man who was wanted on a firearms warrant. IMPD said the man shot at police when they returned fire. He was taken to the hospital where he was later pronounced dead. The officers who fired their weapons have been placed on administrative leave, which is standard procedure. Trauma-informed care could be the first state-mandated continuing education requirement for registered nurses and licensed practical nurses. Abigail Ruman reports a Senate committee moved forward a bill that would create the one-time training requirement for nurses in Indiana.
Trauma-informed care is a healthcare approach that recognizes how trauma and adversity affects patients. The bill would require nurses to complete trauma-informed care training within 5 years of starting a position in direct contact with patients. However, the requirement is not directly tied to licensure. Amanda Gill has been a registered nurse for over 20 years. She says healthcare professionals may not know certain questions or experiences can re-traumatize patients, but this training could mitigate some of those harms.
Do you have any history of sexual, physical, mental abuse? We ask that. It's very standard. I'll be honest to tell you that most healthcare professionals do not expect anyone to say yes. Right? We're just going through the questions, and they don't know what to do when they say yes.
The bill unanimously passed the Senate Health and Provider Services Committee and now heads to the Senate Appropriations Committee. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
Economic development was the only real issue that separated the major Republican candidates for governor at a forum yesterday. U.S. Senator Mike Braun, Brad Chambers, Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch, Eric Daudelin, and Curtis Hill answered questions about private school vouchers, emergency powers, energy, healthcare, and inclusion policies. And their answers to each of those questions were relatively the same. But on economic development, sharper lines were drawn. Braun criticized the state's current strategy, which he says is solely focused on luring big companies to Indiana.
They're expensive, everyone else is competing for them, and they're generally only going to benefit a few places.
Chambers, who recently served as the state's Commerce Secretary, overseeing its economic development efforts, defended that work.
We went out and got an economy that's good for Indiana, that's high wages, to lift people up economically.
Hill was critical of Chambers, but saved his strongest attack for Braun.
We send people to Washington, D.C., and they let us down. We sent Mike Braun to Washington, D.C. at his request, and he gave up and said, I can't get the job done, so I'm coming back to Indiana.
Crouch and Daudelin fell back on the policies they've been pushing for most of their campaigns. For Crouch, that's her proposal to eliminate Indiana's individual income tax.
Now, my opponents, special interest groups, and big spending bureaucrats are screaming bloody murder and saying it can't be done. But that money's not theirs. It's yours.
And Daudelin has been preaching for years the need for a revival of small towns.
And our strategy in the past has been to go after large projects that even bring in more employment, when the real situation we have today is the attraction and retention of talent.
The candidates are seeking to replace Governor Eric Holcomb, who is term limited. And for our final story today, 3 former administrators from troubled virtual schools were arrested this week for an alleged scheme to defraud the Indiana Education Department. From WFYI's Education Desk, Dylan Pierce-McCoy reports the federal prosecutor alleges that the virtual schools received more than $44 million they weren't entitled to.
The U.S. Attorney's Office announced the arrests at a press conference Thursday. Thomas Stoughton, Philip Holden, and Percy Clark were released after appearing in court this week. U.S. Attorney Zachary Myers says Indiana funds schools based on enrollment. If schools have more students, they typically get more money from the state.
The members of the conspiracy falsely claimed thousands of students were enrolled, even though those students were not attending classes or receiving services.
The 3 defendants were charged with many counts related to fraud. Stoughton and Clark were also charged with money laundering. If the defendants are convicted, they could face decades in federal prison. I'm Dylan Pierce-McCoy.
Attorneys for the defendant did not immediately respond to a request for comment. That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by the following people who live in your community: Darian Benson, Drew Daudelin, Kendall Antron, who composed the music for this podcast, and me, Abriana Herron. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back on Monday.